Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Real inspiration for real innovators. If you're looking for innovation and leadership transformation, your journey starts now.
Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Born. Hey, if you're enjoying these innovation insights, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a future episode. By following the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast, you'll stay at the forefront of trends, strategies, and real-world examples that guide today's innovators. And today is no different. I'm sitting down with Andrew Einhorn, and he is the CEO and co-founder of Level Fields. It's an AI-driven Fintech application that automates arduous investment research so investors can find opportunities faster and easier. And his mission is to create AI tools that make advancing financial strategies effortless and accessible for all. What a really cool mission there. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thanks for having me, Natalie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I'd love to know, first and foremost, how in the world did you get into doing this? Like, just talk to us a little bit about your background.
I've had pretty much a traditional career trajectory. So I actually started my career as epidemiologist, studying mercury toxicity in the Gulf of Mexico and environmental contamination in different communities. But I was always a data person. And so as time went on, I started doing some management consulting that got me into consulting for different government agencies, energy companies. So I consult for NASA, FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation, doing things like, assessing orbital debris from horizontal space launches of commercial vehicles, which later became SpaceX, and things of that nature. And I was just always fascinated with data to try to answer a question. It wasn't so much that I loved playing in the sandbox, as I actually liked getting to the result, right? Kind of the search for truth. At some point, I was working for the Defense Department as a contractor for several years, and I was assigned to build a software system to manage all their data. And it was just fell in love with the process of building software. I realized, like, my third grade teacher told me I would never do anything creative. I would never be an artist. So I never tried and went off. And then all of a sudden realized, you know what, I can create something from scratch. I can innovate and come up with something really cool and have it kind of analyze the data automatically so I wouldn't have to spend my whole life in a spreadsheet. And I think that's kind of been the true north for me, my entire career since that moment. It's like, there's a lot of information to analyze. How do we do it effortlessly to get that answer faster and faster? And how do we use software to do it? So before I started Level Fields, I had another company that I had started around 2009. I tend to start companies in the midst of global crises for some reason. That was the financial crisis. And then when COVID hit, I started Level Fields. So this sort of charges me into action. The last company did a lot of event analysis. It was a software company. We predominantly worked with Fortune 500s, super large corporations that were publicly traded. And our job, software, was supposed to identify kind of emerging threats or benefits to the reputation management online, right? So an example would be, we had a train company that was a client, and they would have derailments of those trains maybe 15, 20 times a year. Huh. Oftentimes, the company's so big and these trains are derailing in the middle of nowhere. The C-suite, right? The corporate officers, they wouldn't even know what happened until they saw it on CNN the next day.
Oh my gosh.
So we would have our software systems just monitoring the web, all the news, all the local news, social media. And if somebody, was sitting in their backyard and the train was in their swimming pool and they clicked the photo button on their iPhone and uploaded it to Twitter, we could get that, relay it to the corporate officer and say, Houston, we have a problem here. Mm-hmm. And so they would kind of drum up their press team, put out the statements, try to figure out what went wrong. Was it the train? Was it an accident? Was someone on the tracks? Did they overload the train? Things like that. So anyway, what we saw over time was that every time these actions would happen, there was a share price movement that was in the billions of dollars. And so we were getting, decent sized contracts for this, but it was always kind of in the back of our head. We're like, wow, we see these patterns where there's an event, there's a stock reaction. There's another event, another stock reaction. And over a 10-year period, positive and negative events, you start to see these patterns. So we sold the company in 2019 to a private equity firm. We kind of regrouped and said, what can we do better, smarter, faster, We knew there were some flaws in the previous technology that we had developed because it was based on kind of Boolean search. We wanted to use AI. We wanted to build our own AI system. We weren't really sure exactly what the problem was that we were going to solve. We just kind of knew where we were experts. And then COVID hit, and it crystallized the view that events change everything.
Wow.
Crash the market. We're getting phone calls from family members who are scared about losing their life savings or their kids' college savings. And I was in a unique position at the time of being a data person, B, someone who was into financial markets, and C, largely unemployed since I had just sold my company. So I had lots of time. So I took about 80 hours and analyzed how financial markets had reacted to pandemics, large and small, in the past, came out with my massive spreadsheet and said, the market's going to be right back to where it was in 6 months.
Wow.
And everybody thought it was crazy, but that's exactly what turned out. And there was a reason for it, because that's what the data showed. It wasn't like an opinion. They just looked at these sort of reactions of government to other pandemics and how long it took to roll out a vaccine. And so that sort of crystallized the point of, well, when an event happens, large or small, there is no single source of truth. There's no analytic database to turn to say what normally happens. It didn't exist.
So can I ask a question about that? Would
Please.
you say, how were you able to predict that looking back on that one scenario? Was it really creating a prediction model off of basically historical data, what's already happened? I know we didn't really have a grid for COVID or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what was kind of the basis of how you were able to build that look back in order to look forward?
So you look back, the most recent pandemic before COVID was Zika. Zika outbreak happened. It was largely South America, but when it started to spread, the second it got to the United States, there was a dip in the market. Then there was about a 6% correction when there was intra-country transmission, person to person within the US. And many people in the country don't even know this happened, but they closed the ports of Miami. The airports were shut down. Schools were shut down in South Florida. The cruise industry is shut down, and cruise stocks sold off, roughly 7%.
That's right.
If you look back now, it was the exact same reaction in the market to COVID as what happened with Zika. So you have this sort of microcosm of, okay, I can see travel gets hit first. Leisure, inter-country transmission is the big warning shot across the bow. What else can we learn? The shutdowns, right? So they shut down a lot of the schools. That was the playbook the government was going to use for COVID. They were going to have to shut down the whole country this time. So then you go back earlier, you see the swine flu pandemic, right? And I was actually working for CDC at the time, so I remember it pretty vividly. They rolled that vaccine out very fast. I can't remember if it was 11 or 13 months, but in that range. And so that was okay, so we can get control of this thing in about 13 months because it's so big and because we're further along in the process. We have this mRNA stuff. We could probably expedite that time frame. So I built that in and said, okay, well, if we can get something in 11 months, the market is usually 6 months forward looking. And this was kind of the critical point. It's like, if you're going to have a recession, for example, the market's going to crash 6 months before the recession's announced.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same with a vaccine. So as soon as they see there's a vaccine coming, they're already moving to buy equities. So that was okay, if we're 12 months out and it's going to take 6 months to realize this thing's going to cure, then the market's going to recover in 6 months.
Fascinating. So let's move into your tool that you built and talk
Mm-hmm.
a little bit about how your tool does this, because I would assume that you're also kind of looking at level of magnitude as well as part of this. But let's kind of maybe describe it a little bit to us. How does it work? How can somebody use it? What use cases might they use it for?
Sure. Well, and so these kind of black swan events, right? They don't happen that often. So we wanted to create a tool that would be useful on a day-to-day basis.
Okay.
So we knew we wanted to be in events, but we wanted to look at events that happen over and over again. They weren't maybe quite as scary, right? And these are corporate events, typically like a CEO departure, where a CEO gets hired, company releases a product and it's a dud, or a company releases a product and it's a game changer. We look at government investigations. We look at government actions for and against a corporation. Did they sue them for antitrust? Right? Did they open up an investigation for fraud? Did they approve a cure for a new cancer? Did they do a breakthrough therapy designation to get this thing fast tracked and approved? So lots of those types of events that happen on a regular basis, which can provide either almost like a weather report for somebody and says, okay, I'm sitting here. I own Apple. This event just happened. They lost their CEO. Should I sell my Apple shares? This happened with Amazon when Bezos left. And a lot of people do. They go, oh my God, I got to get out of Amazon. It's going to crash like without Bezos. But we have a data set that shows all large cap companies over a history of many years. And what is the magnitude of the share price going down on average? It's like 10% over a 2-month period. And then it comes back in the third month, right back to where it started, and then goes on usually to new highs.
Wow.
So if you have that in front of you, you can kind of take the emotion out of the decision, right? And you say, you know what, this is not as big a deal as I think it is. It may actually be a buying opportunity if I'm patient about it. I own 100 shares of Amazon. I'm going to own 200. I'm going to wait for this thing to drop. I'm going to buy it cheap. I'm going to make 10% in a month. And then I'm going to go on and either sell it or hold it forever. So there's a lot of that kind of, is it going to rain? How much is it going to rain? Should I bring an umbrella? Should I bring my boots? That's kind of what we're doing, but we're doing it with events, all kinds of events all the time.
Yeah. This is really powerful though, because, when we think about the pattern recognition, the ability to, like you said, say, hey, large organizations see these patterns. We can now make better decisions and investments without having to ride the emotional wave that we may see in the news. That isn't always very helpful to decision making, right? But you're looking back on patterns and saying, hey, these are typical patterns. I wonder, with what's going on in the stock market right now, which is it's recovered a little bit, but overall over the last several weeks, it's been fairly down across the board. Do you see this as a pattern around presidencies and new presidents coming in and patterns around that as well?
You absolutely do. It picks up a lot of things when you can start monitoring the events. So, for example, we started seeing steel companies, U.S. steel companies, increasing their dividends, right? So the market's going down, the sentiment is sour, the belief is that, the tariffs are protectionistic, but the beneficiaries are happy. Like
Right.
Nucor Steel makes all their steel in the U.S. and they're kind of scrap metal, so it's easier to melt down and make. So they're increasing their dividends at a larger interval, 9% increase, or they're doing stock buybacks. So they know that this is going to be beneficial for them. They're already talking to their clients, as suppliers. They have the inside information. They can't relay those conversations, but they do leave these breadcrumb trails for the rest of us who are kind of on the outside trying to figure out, how do I play this thing? And there was a really interesting recent study that showed that the news organizations that made the most money were also the ones that are most negative. Most profitable were the most negative. So there's a strong bias in the media to make a big deal out of things, right? It sells newspapers, it always has. And so if you kind of can look through that noise for these signals and kind of plug your ears to all the opinions and just say, well, that's not what the data shows. The data shows that these companies seem pretty content. They don't seem worried. A worried company doesn't give away more cash. They
Right.
hoard cash. They cut the dividend. And we saw those things during COVID, where they were slashing dividends on the oil companies because they knew no one needed oil because we're all stuck in our houses, driving our cars. So you do see those patterns. And we saw the same when Russia first went into Ukraine, right? It was like, oh my God, this is the beginning of the downturn, 2022. Now we have a war in Europe again. Everything looked kind of bleak, but there were certain companies who were buying back their stock, issuing special dividends, increasing their dividends, and you're like, why? And who are these companies? And there were coal companies, agri companies, because the prices of everything, those commodities were rising. So it was beneficial to them.
Yeah.
A lot of those patterns emerge, and you don't need to necessarily put them together on like a macroeconomic scale to be able to take advantage of identifying companies that are having kind of a bullish cycle while everything else might not be. There's always a counter industry For every failed industry that's happening in the economy, there's usually another one, or at least one, as a ratio 1 to 10, that's doing pretty well.
Yeah.
Interest rates are perfect example, right? High interest rates, bad for a lot of industries, but the banks love it.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of that quote by Warren Buffett, be fearful when others are greedy and be greedy when others are fearful. And it feels
Yeah.
like we're kind of actually in that right now. But I wonder, how do you signal that, or how are you looking at the data to signal whether or not a company is kind of free falling to its demise
Mhm.
versus just down for a bit because of some economic headwinds?
We have a layoff scenario that's pretty useful for that. We have a dividend reduction scenario. And so oftentimes we'll see if it's a poor performing company, right? And on our system, you can filter by like revenue growth, earnings growth, size of the company, how much cash on hand they have, everything. So you
Mm.
can just look at, okay, let's look at a list of companies that are firing people that have poor financials. Those are really companies that are in trouble because their business model never worked well to begin with. They were losing money. Maybe revenue was going down anyway. When you start cutting with a company like that, it's kind of a death spiral. On the other hand, you might have a large corporation that looks at this kind of situation as an opportunity to, quote, restructure things as a way to kind of get rid of maybe poor performers or divisions that they wanted to get rid of, but we're worried they would look like the bad guy if they did it, while things were good.
Yep.
And when things are bad, they can just blame the economy or blame the president for this, cut 4,000 people. And if you're a profitable company cutting 4,000 people, you just became a more profitable company and your share price actually goes up and is rewarded. So there's a lot of those types of signals that are there, give you kind of an early notice. If a company is slashing its dividend, it's generally not, or freezing it, it's not a good thing. But if they're giving away cash, it's a positive. And, we're just looking at these data pieces going, well, they seem confident. Why isn't the market confident
Mhm.
about them? We saw this with Dick's Sporting Goods a couple of years ago. The narrative in the media is brick and mortar's dead.
Mhm.
If you have a brick and mortar store, you're toast. Amazon's going to kill you. Everything has to go online. These old school stores, they're all Macy's. They're all kind of put in the same bucket. And Dick's was there raising their dividend 10%, 15%, 105%. And, you see the graph, well, not a straight line up. During that period where everybody says brick and mortar is done, the company's up 100%, and goes through these dips and cycles because every time a quarterly report came out, it was good. And then people bought, and then the narrative would start that brick and mortar's dead, and they sold, and the stock goes down, and they increase the dividend, and they have another great quarterly report. So you see that again and again, and you're like, it doesn't match up to the lip service that you're seeing on CNBC and other places with the doom and gloom. And the other piece is like mainstream media in the financial sector, they tend to focus on maybe 20 to 30 companies. It's always the same ones, anything involving Elon Musk, and then, the Mag 7, right? Beyond that, you have a little bit of the hyperscalers and the semiconductors, but certainly you don't hear about 6,000 companies, which is how many companies are traded in US stock exchanges. So the reason why we call it level fields is we're able to monitor all of those 6,000 companies, looking for really unique opportunities, high growth companies with good catalysts behind them, in a way that would take you maybe a minute of your day, whereas if you're trying to do it in the older way or reading news and hoping that they identify the winners for you, you're not going to get close to the penetration of the market that an AI system can do, because it's reading 30,000 documents every minute,
Wow.
trying to assess what's going on.
Wow, that's really powerful. So if people are thinking about, maybe they're a novice investor, they haven't done a ton of investing, but this sounds really interesting. And maybe even they're hearing, man, maybe I could understand this a little more with AI kind of churning through the data and helping kind of serve up a better understanding of the lay of the land.
Mhm.
What would be your recommendation if, a novice person is kind of saying, hey, I'd like to enter the market and really start thinking about investing more? Where would you have them start?
We have a really great beginner scenario that anybody can use. What it does, the AI identifies activist investors. These are usually billionaires that buy at least 5% of a company, and their entire goal is to turn a profit. So they want to drive up the share price. They want to take as much cash for themselves as they can. But in the process, they're driving up the share price for everybody else. So you literally just buy when they buy, and then you hold it for 12 months. And while you're doing that, they're in there trying to rally up shareholders, trying to influence the board, trying to, change the direction of the company, sell assets, cut costs, drive up the share price. So you don't have to know anything. The AI is figuring out which are the better activists. And you basically you're just betting on the horse that again and again tends to win. I don't need to know anything other than that. And so you get an alert on the system. It's activist investor invests. You invest in the same stock and you just wait. And we saw this again and again. Salesforce, it's going on with Starbucks right now. They brought in a new CEO. The share price is up 20% right after that. And so you have these jumps that happen on these turnarounds. That's the easiest thing on the whole thing. I mean, you need to know almost nothing. There's a 3-minute video you can watch that's just like, hey, when you get this alert, buy the stock, hold it for 12 months and then sell it.
We're
super easy.
We're kind of coming up on time, but I'd love to know, like, what would be a specific case study where you would say, hey, this really worked well when following kind of the advice?
Yeah, I mean, the Salesforce case study, I think, is probably the best. If you pull up a graph of Salesforce, I don't remember the exact number. I think they were trading around $300 a share, like late 2021. And then the stock fell about 65%, as many of these high growth tech companies that made no money did during 2022. And then from that low point, they rose another 100%. So then you look at a chart and say, well, what turned it around? On our system, you can see every single event on the chart of what happened and why those big increases or decreases happen. So the first thing you see is activist investor comes in kind of at the low point of 2022. And then the next thing you see is one of the two CEOs of Salesforce is fired. Because why do you need to pay two people $30 million a year when you can pay one? So that's a savings right away. And they start to influence the board. The next event you see is a 10% reduction of force. 10% of the company gets fired. And then the next event you see is another firing. Then another activist joins. And then they take all the money that they saved from firing people and they put it into a $20 billion stock buyback.
Wow.
Now, at that point, the analysts on Wall Street pay attention. They upgrade their price target. That's when you start hearing about it on CNBC, after it's already moved 54%. Now everyone else starts to get it on. Oh, Salesforce is back. They got the momentum. It's a profit machine. Goes up another 50% from that point. Very classic turnaround case.
So basically, your tool helps them see kind of what's coming because you guys are reading the news back here. You're looking at those events back here. And then by the time it hits the news, you're buying along with everybody else, which is, it's almost too late. You've kind of missed that moment of what I was saying earlier, be fearful and others are greedy. You've missed your moment, right? Because you're buying along with everybody else and the price is already kind of being driven up at that point.
Yeah, we find the early catalysts that change the trajectory. It could be for a week or it could be for 12 months. Each scenario has a little different time window. And it also gives you that indication of what's about to happen because the playbook is the same for these activists every time. And I actually had this conversation, not to get political, but with somebody the other day. I said, this is pretty much the playbook that we're using for America right now, right? We need to grow revenue. We need to cut costs. We need to pay down the debt. We need to terminate employees. It's the activist playbook. So it's not a surprise that a bunch of business guys who are running the U.S. are doing the same playbook.
Yeah, they're doing what they're their own businesses. That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we need to pay attention to that, understand that is a playbook for sure. Well, man, this has been so interesting. And yeah, I mean, I think people need to go check you out. Tell us a little bit more about how to find you, follow you, and then tell us more about how to find your company.
Sure. It's Level Fields AI is the domain. We have a YouTube channel. You can sign up for a free newsletter. So it's not a huge lift. There's good stock information and tips there. We have a kind of a do-it-yourself membership model for a few $100 a year. You can go in and see all these events, or we also have kind of the premium version of that where we'll actually do it for you, right? We'll tell you, here's the best ones every week, 1 or 2 ideas of what to get into. and why we think it's a good investment based upon data, based upon events. That's our level 2 membership. So, whatever you're comfortable with, we would love to have, obviously, everybody sign up who could. But if not, feel free to just support the project by sharing it with those who are interested in active investing.
Awesome, Andrew. Well, this has been so good and so interesting, and I appreciate you taking time today to educate us on everything in investment, which is really cool. Thanks for your time.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, to our listeners, thank you for joining the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Remember, don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.
Thank you for joining us for the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our show on iTunes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Innovation Meets Leadership, and visit our site at innovationmeetsleadership.com for more innovation resources.
Hey, my new book is out, Set It on Fire, The Art of Innovation. Click on the link to learn more. And don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.